Hello, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for attending our webinar on navigating data protection for housing associations. My name, I'm sure some of you know me, but my name is Hamid Ghafoor, and I lead BDO's social housing team at a national level. And with me today, in terms of the presenters today, are Louise Sadler and Lucy Collins. And I mean, both Louise and Lucy will do their own presentations when they do their bits on the presentation, but they both work in our DRAS team. Louise, particular specialism in data protection, and Lucy in governance. And in terms of the webinar today, we're going to talk particularly looking at from a data perspective, particularly obviously GDPR came in 6 years ago. There's been a lot of progress since then in terms of the way housing associations have managed data, but obviously there's a lot of challenges around some of the regulatory piece around this. And I think some of this, the aspect of this has become even more important now with the new consumer standards and that piece around really understanding what your tenants do and the data around your tenants, and housing associations without doubt are going to require more data about understanding their tenants, and that we will see that coming through. And both Louise and Lucy Louise in particular will talk around where we are around data protection and some of the challenges in the future for housing associations, and Lucy will talk around more around the governance aspects of what needs to be done by the sector in this time of change in this area. In terms of just a few housekeeping points, so please, I'm more than happy that you put questions in the chat, and what we'll do is once Louise and Lucy have done their presentations, we'll come on to those questions and they can answer them, and there should be plenty of time for that at the end of this session. The session should last about roughly an hour, so there shouldn't be any issues from a time perspective. So without further ado, I'll pass you across to Louise.
Thank you, Hamid. Good morning, everyone. Louise Sadler, I've been working in privacy and data protection at BDO for about 6 years now, primarily advising clients, including housing clients, on data protection compliance by completing internal audits, but also working on the advisory side as well. Before joining BDO 6 years ago, I actually worked for a London-based housing association in risk and compliance. So I do have a real interest in the sector and understand some of the challenges faced kind of before GDPR implementation in 2018 and since then as well. So just moving on to the next slide to give you a bit of an indication of some of the areas that we're going to be talking about today. So firstly, I'll sort of set the scene a little bit in terms of the data protection landscape as it is now. I'm then going to walk you through some recent developments in terms of ICO regulatory focus, both specifically in terms of the housing sector and a recent article that was published in December, but also more broadly following an announcement from the Information Commissioner John Edwards last week. I'm then going to walk you through some of our experience working in the sector, working with housing associations and registered providers on data protection compliance, some of the common pitfalls and challenges that we see in the sector. And then I'm going to walk you through a bit of a regulatory update. So looking particularly at the progress of the draft data protection and digital information bill. So looking at where that is in terms of progress of the passage of the bill through the House of Lords, and also what that might mean for housing associations and registered providers as well. And then I'm going to hand over to Lucy, who will talk a little bit about data governance, and then as Hamid just outlined, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So moving on to the next slide, and just to sort of set the scene, as I'm sure you'll be aware, the UK GDPR outlines 7 key principles that organisations must adhere to when processing personal data. Firstly, that personal data should be processed lawfully, fairly and in a transparent manner. So what does that mean? It means that organisations need to have a valid lawful basis, lawful justification for processing personal data. Personal data must be processed fairly, so in a way that an individual could reasonably expect, and transparency is also a core element of this principle, so ensuring that organisations are clearly communicating to individuals how their personal data is being processed. The second principle is purpose limitation, so really defining how personal data will be processed, and typically that's contained within the record of processing activity, which we'll refer to a little bit later on. Data minimization is a key principle, so only processing the personal data required for a specific activity, so really to kind of move organizations away from wholesale capture of large amounts of personal data, when in actual fact organizations should be focusing on only processing the minimum personal data required for a particular activity. Accuracy is a key principle, so ensuring that personal data is accurate and kept up to date. Storage limitation, again, this is something that we'll touch on at various points throughout the presentation this morning. So really getting data controllers to and organizations to define how long personal data will be retained for before it is deleted. The sixth principle is integrity and confidentiality, so ensuring the security of personal data. And then the last principle is the accountability principle, so ensuring that organisations can evidence compliance with the requirements of the UK GDPR on an ongoing basis. Now, clearly, housing organisations and registered providers are exposed to the processing of personal data as part of core business when we consider the tenancy life cycle from application and right throughout management of the tenancy. Also, when we're thinking about other activities such as managing and scheduling maintenance and repairs, managing antisocial behaviour. There's data processing there, potentially some really sensitive special category data as well. Managing community outreach events, administering tenant residence associations, and managing day-to-day queries and complaints. Now, these are all examples of where housing associations are exposed to the processing of personal data as part of core business. But also worth noting that housing organisations are also processing personal data as part of day-to-day operations. So from an employee perspective, when we consider the employee life cycle from recruitment applicants right through to current and then former employees as well. In terms of the impact of non-compliance, I'm sure you'll all be aware the potential fines which the ICO can administer for non-compliance with the UK GDPR is significant, so up to £17.5 million or 4% of global turnover, whichever is greater. But the ICO has a number of enforcement powers at its disposal. Enforcement notices would be an example of that. And I think it's also worth just highlighting the reputational damage or potential impact on of any enforcement on customers, on the regulator, etc., as a result of finding of non-compliance by the ICO. There are wider governance considerations to think about here as well. Worth noting, again, I'm sure you'll be aware that any time that the Information Commissioner's Office issues an enforcement notice or a fine, that is published via the website within the enforcement pages, and so it's usually can be picked up by media outlets as well. Now, before I move on, one of the documents that I've referenced already is this concept of the record of processing activity, and it's we're going to launch a poll now because I will talk about it in later slides as a kind of common pain point that we see some of our housing clients struggling with or find it particularly challenging. So if we just move on to the next slide, we're going to launch a poll because it would be good to understand from your perspective how you currently document your record of processing activity, if known, whether that's via Excel, whether you document that via a kind of an Excel spreadsheet, or whether you use a privacy compliance tool. So it'd be good to sort of gauge from yourself sort of how you're typically documenting that. I'm going to leave another sort of 10 seconds. Hopefully you should have received an automated prompt. Okay. Brill. We'll leave that there. Really interesting stats, actually. 83% of respondents stated that they use Excel spreadsheet to document their record of processing activity, and 17% use a compliance tool, which is broadly in line with what we see when working with housing organisations and registered providers in data protection compliance. So yeah, some interesting stats there. Okay, so just moving on to the next slide. I thought it'd be useful just to kind of give you an overview of some of the areas that the regulator is focusing on. Now, there hasn't been, as far as I'm aware, I haven't seen any enforcement notices or fines specifically handed down to housing organisations or registered providers of late. However, the ICO did publish an article in December 2023, which focused on how data protection law can prevent harm in the housing sector, and we can sort of share the link to that after this webinar. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. So the article highlighted a number of key themes, which are based on complaints which individuals have made directly to the ICO about housing organisations and registered providers. And I'll walk you through some of those key themes in just a moment, but I think what it highlights is that whilst there haven't been any kind of specific financial penalties or enforcement notices that have been handed down of late, the ICO does have one eye on the sector. And so I think there's some useful insights in terms of what that article contains when thinking about some of the common themes which it's identified within the sector as well. So just kind of walking through some of those. Firstly, the article highlighted a lack of understanding of data protection law. So from that perspective, really important to consider what do training and awareness programs look like within your organisation. Is data protection training incorporated throughout the employee life cycle? Are you comfortable that individuals are aware of how to identify a subject access request or a data breach where potentially strict time limits apply? Another theme identified was poor record keeping, and I think that links quite nicely to the poll that we just launched. Obviously, your record of processing activity, your ROPA, we'll talk about it in just a moment, but it is a really big document to keep up to date, and poor record keeping was a key theme highlighted within this article as being a particular pain point that some housing organisations and registered providers struggle with. Data accuracy, we spoke about this on the first slide, being one of the key principles of the UK GDPR, ensuring that personal data is accurate and up to date. Really important when considering perhaps some of the most vulnerable tenants and residents as well. And then a final key theme that was highlighted within the article is inappropriate disclosures of personal data as well. And the ICO has referred to a data sharing code of practice, which is also hyperlinked, so we can share these links after the webinar. So a really interesting article published by the ICO there. I think it was also worth mentioning some of the key priorities for the ICO looking forward as well. So I attended the International Association of Privacy Professionals conference in London last week, and the Information Commissioner John Edwards delivered one of the keynote speeches and set out the three key priorities for the ICO over the next year or so. So these are firstly children's data. I think there's a real recognition at the ICO that obviously children are most vulnerable in society, and so their personal data warrants a higher degree of protection. So there's a real ICO focus on how organisations are processing and safeguarding children's data. The second area of focus is advertising technologies, so cookie compliance. This I think is really interesting and may be relevant within your organisations as well. So essentially the ICO conducted a pilot at the start of the year where it looked at cookie settings for the top 100 UK websites and found that 53 of those were not compliant with data protection cookie compliance requirements. Essentially, the principle being that cookies should be as easy to reject as they are to accept, and as a result of those findings, the ICO has contacted those organisations that were not compliant in order for that to be remedied. But one point that the Information Commissioner did raise last week is that actually the ICO has recently completed a hackathon and is looking to monitor cookie compliance and increase the scale of monitoring compliance with cookie requirements. So yeah, just worth noting that this is something that the ICO is focusing on, and so it's worth just checking that cookie arrangements are compliant with GDPR requirements and essentially are as easy for an individual to reject as they are to accept. And then the final area of focus for the ICO, this will come as no surprise, is obviously a focus on AI as emerging technology, which is very fast moving. And so this is something that the ICO is going to be focusing on for the next 12 months as well. So I think useful just to kind of highlight some of the areas that the ICO is focusing on more broadly, but also specifically in relation to housing organisations and registered providers. Moving on to the next slide, I thought it'd be useful to just highlight some of the common pitfalls or challenges that we see working with housing organisations as well, just to sort of supplement what the ICO is looking at in the previous slide. So firstly, and I've called it the dreaded ROPA, or the dreaded record of processing activity. As I've already alluded to, the ROPA is the primary way in which an organisation is able to evidence complete oversight of data processing activities. It's really important because it forms the basis of your privacy notices, so ensuring that privacy notices are accurate and up to date. It forms the basis of your data subject rights procedures because it tells you what systems personal data is stored in when managing a data subject rights request, for example. And the ROPA should also give you oversight of those third parties that organisations are sharing personal data with and their location to highlight any possible international exposure, international transfer exposure. So I think something that we typically see in the sector is varying things. So sometimes we see organisations that may have developed a ROPA back in 2018, but it hasn't perhaps been up to date, hasn't been updated since. Sometimes we see ROPAs which have not been developed at all, and so we see a kind of a broad range of difficulties there. What I would say is that, we very much recognise that the ROPA is a very time and resource intensive document to collate. It involves a lot of engagement from the wider business, but given its importance and given it is the cornerstone of your privacy compliance framework, I would say that is sort of an area that a number of our clients broadly actually struggle with. A second common pain point that we see is lack of time or resource dedicated to ongoing compliance efforts. So one of the key principles that we looked at in the first slide is kind of ongoing accountability being one of the key principles of the UK GDPR. And so here sometimes we see that the role of data protection lead or DPO, if your organisation has appointed a DPO, is sometimes tacked onto an existing job role, and actually we see some housing organisations and registered providers struggling if they're receiving a high volume of subject access requests typically, or if they're firefighting data breaches. Sometimes kind of lack of time and resource can be a common pain point that we come across as well. Lack of oversight of data processes. So again, ensuring that organisations have complete oversight of those third parties that they are sharing personal data with, in order to ensure that there are contracts in place which include the relevant data processing provisions. Again, this all goes back to the ROPA, but this is something that we see some of our clients struggling with. Another common pain point is around retention. Now, storage limitation is one of the key principles of the UK GDPR, which we outlined in the first slide, and defining and operationalizing retention periods is a common pinch point. It's significant in the context of data protection because the UK GDPR requires organisations to define retention periods in order to comply with the storage limitation principle, but there are broader data governance considerations as well, which Lucy's going to talk about in just a moment. And then finally, I guess a common pinch point that we see, and this was highlighted in the first poll, was around an over-reliance sometimes on manual tools to ensure continued compliance. So documenting your ROPA via Excel can be great, but it also, depending on the volume of personal data, depending on the exposure to processing of personal data, the size of your organization, the extent of data processing, we see some clients that actually Excel is a tool that is a useful starting point, but can quickly fall down. And so it's quite interesting to see that stat earlier of the 17% of organizations that are using a privacy compliance tool to document their processing activities. Also, just a little bit of a plug here. So BDO, our colleagues BDO in Jersey, developed Robust, which is a data privacy compliance tool initially for internal use, but that is being something that is being rolled out to clients for those that are interested as well, and kind of looking to move away from over-reliance on manual spreadsheets to document compliance activities. Okay, so just moving on to the next slide, I think we've got another poll for you. So it'd be really interesting to understand from attendees whether you think there is as much focus on data protection in your organisation now as there was in 2018. Is it something that has remained a focus? Is it something that was perhaps there was a lot of focus back in 2018, but it's been tapering off? It'd be good to understand that. So I think there's a poll that's being launched at some point, and it'd be good to see the results from that. So I'll leave you just a couple of seconds just to respond to that poll. Okay. Hopefully you've had a chance to respond. Brilliant. Okay. Interesting stats there. So of those of you that have responded, so 66% are saying yes, there is as much focus on data protection as there was in 2018, and 34% saying no. So some really interesting stats there. Obviously there is the sort of ongoing accountability principle, but we and going back to a common pinch point or pain point that we see some of our clients struggle with is this sort of time and resource dedicated to ongoing compliance. So some interesting stats there. Thank you for that. Okay, so just moving on to the next slide, it would be remiss of me to talk about data protection without giving you an update on the progress of the draft Data Protection and Digital Information Bill and its passage through Parliament. So in terms of a bit of an update, progress to date, so the draft bill was introduced to the UK Parliament in March 2023. And as it currently stands, it is in the committee stage in the House of Lords. And I think there's going to be a line-by-line review of the draft bill in the House of Lords on the 20th of March. So we may well see some sort of further developments on that towards the end of the month. It is, however, anticipated that the bill will receive royal assent before the next general election. So we just wait to see what the shape of that will look like. The only, I guess there is a question potentially on the UK's adequacy status. So by way of context, the draft bill proposes a number of changes to the UK Data Protection Act 2018 and some slight kind of a bit of a move away from some of the requirements of the EU GDPR, which was enshrined into domestic law in 2018. There is a question mark as to whether, if the bill goes through, receives royal assent, whether the European Commission will continue to grant the UK adequacy status. Now, why is this significant? Essentially, the European Commission grants certain countries adequacy status based on an assessment of their data protection laws, and countries which have adequacy status means that personal data can flow from the EU to the UK. Now, if the UK loses its adequacy status, that will cause issues for a number of organisations who process personal data about individuals based in the EU. So there's a question there as to whether, what will happen to the UK's adequacy status if and when the draft bill receives royal assent. In terms of some of the proposed changes, as outlined in the draft bill, firstly, a potential loosening of the requirement for organisations to maintain a record of processing activity, which is really interesting. We've referenced it already a couple of times this morning, but essentially what the proposal is in the draft bill is that organisations only need to document high-risk data processing activities. It's a really interesting inclusion in the draft bill. I know that the sort of spirit of the draft bill was to sort of move away from a lot of the kind of administrative burden that organisations experience around data protection compliance, but actually it's difficult to see how organisations will be able to comply with the transparency principle and accountability principle if data processing isn't documented internally. So it will be interesting to see what happens there. Subject access requests. Now, housing organisations and registered providers are, typically receive a large number of subject access requests. The draft bill seeks to clarify the definition of vexatious and excessive requests in order to kind of clarify the grounds for refusal, which, should be helpful and essentially make it slightly easier for organisations to refuse vexatious or excessive subject access requests. Complaints management. So the draft bill proposes implementing the requirement for individuals to lodge complaints with the data controller before escalating that complaint directly to the ICO. Now, currently, individuals can make a complaint directly to the ICO. This new requirement would require individuals to sort of exhaust internal procedures first before escalating a complaint to the ICO. And I think part of the reason for that was to ensure that the ICO could sort of focus its limited resources on specific areas rather than just sort of focusing a lot of time and resource on complaints management. And then a final proposed change is around data protection impact assessments and the ICO issuing guidance for processing activities where a DPIA is required. So yes, a little bit of kind of clarification there as well. If we step back from the draft bill, what is the potential impact on housing organisations and registered providers? 2 points for me to raise here. Firstly, housing organisations and registered providers are still required to comply with the requirements of the UK Data Protection Act 2018. So, there is that requirement to comply with current law. Up until the draft Data Protection Digital Information Bill receives royal assent. However, it's worth noting that if your organisation is broadly compliant with the requirements of the UK Data Protection Act 2018, the proposed changes as a result of the draft bill will be minimal. I think what we're talking about here is minor tweaks in processes rather than wholesale implementation of new new processes and new timelines, which is what we saw back in 2018 when the GDPR was enshrined into domestic law. So yeah, the key message here being that if you're broadly compliant with the UK GDPR, the Data Protection Act 2018, the changes as a result of the draft bill being implemented will be minimal. So I'm going to hand over to Lucy now, who's going to talk a little bit more about data governance more broadly.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, so hi everyone, as introduction, my name's Lucy Collins. I'm a manager in our digital risk and advisory services team. I think I recognise a few of the names in the chat today, so hopefully a couple of you have come across me before. Here today to focus on sort of the data governance element of this, which is by no way a new offering or a new emphasis in the sector, but I think there's a few things that are going on externally that are bringing it to the fore. So within BDO, I work within the housing sector and wider sectors as well. Some organisations who are data rich and a real data leading organisations have really elements of good practice of data governance, as well as some who are just starting out on their journey and are trying to get advice on what that framework should look like and what the best fit for their organisation looks like that isn't a best in class, but something that will work for them. So a real range of maturity in regards to data governance. So the bits I'll cover today, so if we can just go on to the next slide, please, Caroline. Great. So the main sort of overview of what I'll talk about today. So first and foremost, a whistle-stop tour of what data governance is and the benefits that an embedded framework can bring. Secondly, why data governance is an increasingly important topic, mainly because of a shift in regulatory focus, as well as a lot of external pressures that aren't specific to the housing sector, but you will be feeling them. And then thirdly, a bit on some of the pain points that we've experienced from some of our clients in trying to embed a data governance framework, and some of the obstacles they've had to overcome and some of the starting points that they've done as sort of quick wins to try and help embed those frameworks and get their policies and processes rolled out across the organisation. So first of all, what is data governance? And I suppose really briefly, because I'm conscious of time, data governance is the process of managing your data. So the life cycle, its availability, usability, integrity, and security. It's the real life cycle from cradle to grave, creation to deletion of all of your data, whether that be financial data, tenant data, customer data, stock asset management data. Housing associations are rich in data, and that's something that isn't new to you and you've been managing for a number of years. So it's not a new experience, but the way that we're using data and the value it can bring are starting to be explored more in the sector at the minute. So some of the benefits of having an embedded framework. So this first point is having a consistent data source, so one version of the truth. I would be surprised if that didn't resonate with a few people on the call. I know a lot of organisations who have been through changes in management, changes in systems, changes in structure, and all of that means that there is sometimes a lack of accountability in the ownership of data and what is our one true source, so how we align data across the systems that we use. A really good time to look at your data and try and cleanse that and make sure that it is accurate is that sort of system implementation stages. And we work with a few other clients at the minute who are sort of requirement setting on new systems. So really trying to articulate what they want that system to give them and how they need it to operate in order to be able to give them that one version of the truth and minimize the number of systems that they have in place. The next point here is around sort of having improved data quality and integrity. So one of the foundational aspects of a data governance framework is having a data strategy. So outlining why you're collecting data in the first place. And this is a principle that's in keeping with one of the principles as part of the GDPR compliance in saying, do you have a lawful basis of processing your data? Have you articulated why you are collecting that data? And the same principle applies to data governance. If you have a purpose for collecting a piece of data, whether that be to satisfy a regulatory condition, to inform a new business process that you are trying to implement, to understand where best to focus your asset management, stock condition, plan maintenance schedules on the things that matter most to your customers. Understanding what you want to know from that data means that you can clearly articulate what you need to collect, which will only therefore increase the quality of that, but also the integrity. So if there's a purpose to a piece of data, you can say, well, in order for that to be relevant to us and relevant to our decision making, it needs to have been refreshed in the last 12 months or in the last 5 years, because it's something that it needs to be relevant for now or from 5 years ago. So it helps to establish and define those continuous update monitoring processes that flow from a data governance strategy. Having that consistent data source and improved data quality and integrity can only inform decision making better. So having accurate, up-to-date, complete, reliable information is fundamental for boards to monitor all of your key areas. So financial management, rent setting, stock condition, tenants' needs, board oversight and control and discharge of those duties is completely undermined by a failure to maintain data integrity, or by data that's sort of siloed and isolated in different systems that can't be accessed by the right people at the right times to be able to make those informed decisions. And then the last point here is really just to strengthen regulatory compliance. So having oversight and accountability of the data that you hold, where it is, how long we've had it, can help with things like Louise has been talking about for the first half an hour or so of this webinar, things like GDPR compliance. I think she touched on it very briefly earlier, but one area that a lot of people struggle with is operationalizing retention schedules. Quite often there's a reliance on manual control to implement those schedules. There's usually a policy in place which has been approved by data protection, but then it's how we actually implement that in the organisation. With some of the new regulatory changes and legislation that's come in, which I'll come on to next, so things like the consumer standards and tenant satisfaction measures, the regulator is expecting more data to be held in some certain areas, which means that not adhering to retention means that if you were to have a loss of data or a breach of data, those instances would now be larger than they were previously due to the larger amounts of data that you are holding. So it's an area of focus, I think, going forwards, to make sure that those retention schedules are operationalized and making sure that we have a data governance framework and an expectation that's embedded across the organisation so that it really brings different departments together. So how do we leverage off our IT and security colleagues to automate some of these processes and reduce our risk and take some of that manual element out of it? If we just pop on to the next slide then. So that was a brief overview of some of the benefits that the framework can bring. I suppose now is sort of, why is data such a hot topic at the minute? And I think in the social housing sector, for a number of years, the regulator has recognised that data integrity and quality has been a risk. It's been in the sector risk profile for a number of years, slightly reworded each year on year. So it's not a new area, and it's something that most RPs will have been focusing on internally anyway. But I think there's been a real shift in focus from the regulator in some of the consultation that they've released and some of the legislation that's coming in. So the new consumer standards, which they released more information on last week, the introduction to have to report TSMs, they're now really shifting their focus to say, yes, we know it's been an issue, and these are some of the things that we're going to start measuring you by. So that framework, that data governance framework, suddenly becomes even more important to make sure that the information that we're being asked to give is accurate, is relevant, has been updated, that we have faith in the information that's being put in there. Louise touched on it briefly earlier, but the last two bullet points here are not housing specific. They are for all organisations. So AI is not something I would claim to be an expert on, but I think it's been a hot topic of conversation, not just within businesses and within your own place of work, but with friends and sort of on social media, on people just dipping into it, seeing what it's like. And I think the introduction of a technology like this poses a substantial amount of reward to organisations, but also brings with it a new level of risk. As with any other processing activity in an organisation, the main thing of importance here is to make sure that there's a governance framework around the use of that technology. So I think Louise mentioned it earlier, one of the themes in one of the recent ICO articles was that there'd been sort of a focus or a note of inappropriate disclosures of personal data. So have we communicated within our organisations to staff that this technology isn't owned by us? We can't put all of our information in, not just personal information from tenants and customers that we hold, but business sort of intellectual property, things that you don't want to get out into the market, things that are your own internal processes. So have we established a governance framework in line with how we would govern any other process and any other piece of data to say, what's the purpose of using AI? What are we allowed to use it for? When might we use it for? How do we quality review the output of it? With AI, the output is only as good as what's been put in. So although it can be a really useful tool, it needs that QA and independent scrutiny at the end to make sure that what's been brought out is accurate and in line with your expectations and can be used. And then another part of that governance framework, so how do we then monitor the use of that within the organisation? And one of the key things I think here is, and this is what a data governance framework should aim to do, it should expand a lot of these practices across an organisation and bring the whole organisation into the same mindset. So the same with the use of things like AI. How do we ensure this isn't siloed to very specific individuals and specific people in the business? So not just allowing our IT team to use it, but IT teams collaborating with data protection teams to make sure that what they're doing is in line with GDPR compliance, trying to roll out use cases with other areas of the organisation who are undergoing projects and change to try and help them and add value to their processes. How do we make this something that is suitable for the whole organisation and not just certain elements of it? The last sort of area here that has an impact on our data and the integrity of it is cybersecurity and information security threats. Again, another hot topic for all organisations. I think it's on every risk register I've looked at for every client I've worked at for the last few years. The increased use of technology, online service delivery, change in working arrangements, the introduction of agile working arrangements in place has left organisations more vulnerable to phishing attempts, malware, ransomware attacks. So ensuring that we have integrity over that data and our systems is key. I know it's a risk discussion and a risk appetite discussion on how far you go sometimes with cyber security and the investment in there, because the goalposts are always changing. You could throw your whole budget at it and then something could change next week. That means that what you have is no longer best in class. It needs amendments. So it's something that stays at the top of a risk register and stays at the fore of management discussion, but is something that should be tightly controlled and kept on the agenda. If we just move on to the next slide. So just to outline sort of the three main pain points, I suppose, from our experience of working with not just people in the housing sector, but across other sectors as well. And the three sort of key blockers, I suppose, to getting a framework embedded are often a lack of resource and ownership within that structure. So ensuring that we have executive sponsorship of such a plan and a framework to embed, trying to disseminate roles and responsibilities throughout an organisation. So not just being IT's department, IT's responsibility. How do we empower people in other departments to help that journey? So the establishment of data owners, data managers, data stewards to help bring the business along on that journey. Poor data quality has been an issue, and it's always one of the key things that inhibits some of these things. And then that culture piece and lack of buy-in, sometimes just a lack of awareness of why this is important and why it can help a business. So some of the quick wins I've seen with organizations trying to implement a data governance framework are increasing that training and awareness to senior stakeholders. So either running workshops and webinars internally to raise awareness, or getting external parties in to try and help and give training, so that tone from the top and that buy-in from the top is clear and that disseminates throughout an organization. One of the other things I've seen be really useful is sort of demonstrating business value in the development of sort of quick wins and case studies. So picking real problem bits of data and showing how more control and more structure around it can help, and actually defining some real quantifiable metrics as a use case to say, look, we really improved a process in this area that we were struggling with, or that you asked for MI on. If we had more investment and more resource, we could roll this out and really drive some of our processes forward and get the best value for money out of them. I think some of the ways that we've been involved with some of our clients are on running training sessions, assisting in data migrations, helping with system selection, so requirement selection and understanding systems to help with your priorities. And then again, just sort of your standard design operational effectiveness of governance frameworks in place. So I'll pause there, just a bit of a brief overview, bringing to the fore some of the things that people are talking about, and I will hand over to Hamid to see if there are any questions and just wrap up at the end.
Louise, Lucy, thank you very much for that. That was really interesting around some of the changes happening around this. I think what it demonstrates is this is an area that there is constant change happening, and a lot of challenge. And actually, for the future, what we're going to see is even more challenge around some of these areas, both from a regulatory perspective and also from an organisational perspective. Just in terms of questions, I think a little bit quiet, if I'm being honest, but I suppose as I was listening to that, it would be one of the things that sort of crossed my mind is that I've obviously been involved in housing a long time, social housing a long time, and one of the things I've seen is this piece around data across an organisation. I think Lucy, you touched upon this, and I suppose it's a question for Lucy really about, do you think there is a consistent approach in terms of your experience? Do you see a consistent approach to data governance across social housing organisations, or is it like you say a little bit scattergun?
I think there's a range of maturity, but it's been scattered and siloed in recent years. So different teams have managed data in different ways, which has not helped with that sort of single version of the truth. What I think people are understanding now with some of the reporting requirements are that different departments need the same information for different purposes. So how do you work together to make sure that you've got all of that updated in the same place? So the drive now is to have that organisational wide approach that isn't siloed, so you can all sort of make best use of the data that you've got.
Do you think this should be on people's risk maps? How they manage data, especially with everything that's going on, with all the additional requirements that are going to come out from obviously the announcement last week around consumer standards, and that's obviously coming in. Lots of additional requirements, probably still a bit of uncertainty exactly how that will flow through. But I think the one thing that's certain is that you will have a much better understanding of your tenants. And I think, do you see that on risk maps and in terms of data as itself? Because if you, like Louise was talking about, from a data perspective, it's not about a particular element. It's across the whole organisation. So should it be on risk maps?
I think at the minute, in a lot of places, it implicitly is in certain different risks, like you said. So with asset management and stock condition, having it as an action or something that is raising that risk because we don't have the information that we need. I think more so it might start to emerge as its own risk as it spreads more into sort of legislative requirements and reporting. But I think implicitly in a lot of places it already is. It's just bringing that to the fore on, have we got something centrally that's actually addressing this across all of our risks, rather than, again, that siloed approach in different areas, that it's something in different areas. Can we make it a joined up approach?
Cool. Okay. Yeah, no, and I agree with you. I think it needs to be more joined up. Got a couple of questions on the chat now, which is good to see. So probably one for Louise. Louise, do you have any more information about FOI Lite?
It's a really good question, and I don't, I'm afraid. I know the Information Commissioner's Office has recently issued a number of organisations with enforcement action because of kind of lack of transparency around freedom of information requests. But this term isn't something that I've come across. We tend to kind of more focus within our team on the data protection side rather than kind of organisational transparency from a FOI perspective.
Okay, thank you. Another question. What, again, probably for you, Louise, actually, what is your recommendation regarding the best tool for ROPA?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually quite a difficult one to answer because it does depend on your organisation. So and I alluded to this earlier when we were talking about ROPAs and how they're documented, whether they're documented on a Excel spreadsheet or using a tool. I think Excel spreadsheets can be great, but some of the kind of areas where we see clients struggle with this is perhaps where, instead of kind of leading your ROPA with the description of the data processing activity, the kind of leading factor within the ROPA is the type of data, which can kind of make the whole rest of the document really kind of complex and difficult and knotty to document. Instead of the best tool, there are a number of tools out there, some which are kind of bigger than others, some which are all singing and all dancing and have very kind of aggressive update processes, others which are sort of a lot kind of more simplified, but actually are just a good way of documenting your data processing activities, allocating responsibility to potential data leads within the organization. Also can be good kind of to document your data breaches, data subject rights requests, contracts with data processors, that sort of thing. I can't really sort of give any specifics around which tools we would specifically kind of recommend. But
what you're saying is it needs to be tailored to what your organisational needs are, and I suppose it links into another question just to come in around. I mean, these tools in themselves, is there a budget issue around this, or is it the fact that organisations probably haven't quite picked up on the importance of actually having this type of? I mean, obviously any organisation has priorities in terms of different data management, and do you think the is it a budget issue? Are they, is there a cost issue around it, or is it more around organisations themselves haven't quite picked up on how important it is to probably have this type of tool?
I think it's both. I think, back in 2018, we saw a lot of organisations developing ROPAs with varying degrees of success. And I think some clients that we speak to say, well, we've done that now. We've developed our ROPA. It's perhaps not fit for purpose. We're developing our privacy notices independently of the ROPA. But there's a kind of a reluctance to go back and understandably allocate limited time and resource to kind of an organisation-wide data mapping. But we see some clients that use Excel spreadsheet and it works really well for them, but actually they're looking to enhance their privacy maturity posture and would want kind of a privacy tool to kind of automate some of those processes a little bit easier, and that's perhaps that's where we see some kind of budget constraints being more of an issue. So we see a kind of wide range of issues here, and I think that's why I sort of alluded to it as the dreaded ROPA earlier in the presentation, because it is a common pinch point. But yeah, we see a range of issues as a result.
Okay. Another question, slightly more about governance, is where is guidance for data retention? The NHF guidance is all. Actually, I can answer a little bit of this because I've been looking at some of this stuff on. I think the question around data retention really depends on what type of data you're talking about. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. And I think, so for example, the new Building Safety Act talks about, basically adds on additional requirements around data retention around properties of a certain size, and actually some of that piece around that is quite onerous in terms of it's gone beyond the sort of 6 years going backwards. It goes beyond that, and actually you can have claims for issues on property that that go back a lot longer than that, which is quite interesting to see, and could be quite challenging. I'm not sure the sector's quite picked up on that. I think, I don't know, Lucy, have you got any more to add on that question around data retention? Because I do, the point around this NHF guidance is old, and I suppose an element of that is this is quite a fast moving area, but I don't know if you got anything to add on that, Lucy.
I think you make a point that it is old, and like you said, some of the new regulation that they're bringing out, they're trying to be more explicit on some of it. Louise, I'm sure there's tools on the ICO website as well, which should guide on a lot of these areas and sort of cross-referencing to recent legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult because retention is governed sometimes in law, and sometimes it's governed by organisational requirement. So whilst I think the NHF template can be useful to a point, there does need to be kind of a recognition that there's it's going to be different for each organisation, but obviously there are some retention periods that are clearly defined in law, but others that need to be guided by organisational requirement.
So it is quite challenging, isn't it, in terms of that piece. I think the guidance isn't great. So hopefully NHF will look at that and try and update on where they're up to on that moment. We're suddenly getting a torrent of questions coming in. So another quick one around ICO, the ROPA. Is the ICO ROPA template a good document to use, or would you advise to develop one in-house? Again, Louise, I think.
And yeah, thank you. Yeah, and another great question. I think the difficulty that we see with the ICO ROPA is that it's a one size fits all, and actually this goes back to, you know, depending on the volume of data processing that your organization is doing, it can be very difficult to capture data processing in a meaningful way using the ICO ROPA. So I think it's a really useful starting point, but I think things like, you know, linking your DPIAs within that document can suddenly become very kind of cumbersome. I think there's some kind of columns within the ICO template which would benefit from just being kind of renamed slightly to kind of simplify the titles there. So when we're running implementation programs for clients, we tend to, you know, use the ICO template as a starting point, but tweak it slightly just to make it clearer and perhaps a little bit more manageable, because there are so many columns in that ROPA that document all of your processing activities. Using that template is quite a task.
Thank you. And I think the final question, it's a really good question, actually. So what are your thoughts on data sharing agreements and whether these should be in place with all contractors, suppliers having access to our tenants' data? So that's part one of the question. And part two of the question, is it appropriate to take the view that it is in our privacy statement and part of the performance of contract? So again, Louise?
Yeah, sure. So there's two parts to this. I think firstly, data sharing agreements. So as we mentioned earlier, obviously your ROPA needs to document who you're sharing personal data with in order to ensure that there are contracts or data sharing agreements in place with those third parties. That's really important because if you're a data controller, then there's a requirement to ensure that you have oversight of the third parties that you're sharing personal data with, and, you know, having a contract in place or a data sharing agreement in place kind of safeguards that data once it's shared with a third party, once you as controller no longer have control of it, essentially. So I think it is important to have data sharing agreements with all contractors and suppliers that have access to tenant data. I think the second part of that question is more around the privacy statement. Now, the privacy statement is how you communicate to individuals how their personal data is processed. So that doesn't kind of replace the contract with suppliers. It's more kind of notifying individuals how their data is used rather than forming a part of a contract with suppliers.
So probably,
I'd
I'd say probably an area that you probably, if you're going to go down with data sharing, probably just you need to get some proper legal advice around this, don't you, to make sure it is watertight.
Yeah, exactly. Firstly, knowing all the organisations that you're sharing personal data with or have access to that personal data, and then B, ensuring that there are contracts in place.
Okay, and I think that's it for questions. I know that's timing's perfect because we're right up to an hour. So I just want to firstly thank both Louise and Lucy for the session today. I hope that's been really useful, and certainly I've learned a lot around some of the challenges around data protection, and particularly from a governance perspective. This is one of a series of webinars that what we are doing in terms of from a rethinking housing point of view, and there will be further seminars on other topical areas that are impacting on social housing. But I'd just like to thank obviously the speakers today, and thank all you for attending today, and we'll leave it at that. So thank you and good morning.